Thank you, Anne. With that, we'll begin the show. The obligatory orientation slide of Santa Cruz Island, along with the Northern Channel Islands. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Northern Channel Islands. A few facts you might not be familiar with. Santa Cruz Island is owned to the water's edge. That's the way it was established in its original granting to a man named Andre Costillero. Santa Cruz Island is more than 3 times larger than Hong Kong. It's 4 times larger than Manhattan. It's larger than the District of Columbia. Carey Stanton was its only registered voter for quite a time. Tonight I'm not talking about the Carey family and their development of Santa Cruz Island. Suffice it to say that in the 19th century, a man named Justinian Carey developed a very large ranch in the Central Valley on Santa Cruz Island. He also established a number of satellite ranches. And this is as the Central Valley main ranch appeared in the 1880s as developed by Justinian Carey. We're here this evening to talk about the Stanton family, the pater of that family being Edwin Loxley Stanton, shown here. Ed was born in San Diego in 1893, and he was one of 3 boys. He had a brother named Herbert and a brother named Forrest. And he was in the envious position of having inherited about $100,000 somewhere around 1910 or 1911. Each of his brothers inherited an equal amount of money. He's the only one of the 3 brothers who advanced and done good. Ed went to Berkeley. He was an athlete. In fact, for a time, he considered becoming an athlete of Olympics caliber. He graduated in 1915, and the following year, he met and married Evelyn Carey. Notice her last name is C-A-R-E-Y. Their second-born son is named for her maiden name, Carey Stanton. Ed left for World War I. When he came back, they had 2 sons, Ed Jr., who was born in 1918, and Carey, who was born in 1923. Being a family of means, they were able to travel. This is a passport photo of the Stanton family in 1934, just prior to their trip to China. Here you see Ed, Evelyn, his wife, Eddie, the son, and Carey Stanton. Carey on your left, Eddie on the right. There was great dissension in the Carey family for over a decade, and Santa Cruz Island was put on the market for sale. It remained on the market for over a dozen years. This shows the ranch in 1932, during the time Santa Cruz Island was for sale. The western 9/10 of the island were for sale. The eastern 10th of the island had been divided off in 2 parcels that went to Justinian Carey's descendants. The 5 parcels that created the western 9/10 of the island were reunited as a parcel for sale. It wasn't until April 10th, 1937 that escrow closed, Edwin Stanton being the lucky buyer. I have to laugh because the newspapers of the day have headlines that say, Santa Cruz Island sells for $1 million. Carey's dad paid $750,000 for the island, not $1 million. But Carey never corrected people. He sort of liked people to think that it really did sell for $1 million. An interesting thing about this article says that the island comes with 12,000 head of sheep and 900 head of cattle. The Careys had removed quite a bit of their livestock prior to the sale, but obviously there were considerable numbers of animals left on the island. In 1937, this is what the island looked like when the Stanton family took possession. You look up here, you see the hundreds of sheep coming down. Here they're being rounded up and taken to the main ranch. One of the first things Ed Stanton did was to reduce the number of sheep on Santa Cruz Island and get them off of the island. He did the same with cattle so that he could reintroduce Herefords, the cattle of his choice. And I like this shot because Justinian Care had planted quite a number of eucalyptus trees in the 1880s, and at this point these trees were only about 60 years old. They're relatively small compared to the grove as you see it today. The year Ed Stanton was born, 1893, the Care family had the schooner Santa Cruz built in Benicia, California, and the schooner Santa Cruz came with the sale of the island as one of her assets. One of the things Ed Stanton did immediately upon purchasing the island was to change the configuration of the schooner Santa Cruz, and he added this rather boxy wheelhouse to the stern of the boat. Here you see Prisoners Harbor in 1939, the sheep being walked down to the end of the pier so that they would be loaded on the vessel for shipment to the mainland. Here you see some of the sheep coming into market. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to be a boy, barely a teenager, to have your parents buy the largest privately owned island off the continental United States. Here's Carey Stanton on their redesigned ship making passage to or from the island, and with his mother on one of their trips to the island. In those days, the communication on the island was strictly by radio. This is Ed Stanton at the ranch, presumably trying to talk to someone on the mainland. The communication was spotty at best, but it's all they had. I love some of these early pictures in the 30s and 40s showing the life of the very well-to-do family. They lived in Los Angeles in Hancock Park, and this is how they roughed it on their island. Mrs. Stanton often traveled with her maid and quite often would have 3 friends, so there would be a foursome for bridge. Grain here being offloaded from the schooner in the pickup truck hauled to the ranch. The Care family, when they had the island, used primarily horse-drawn vehicles. The Stantons introduced trucks and vehicles. Evelyn Stanton with a lost lamb. And here's Carey, the year that they bought the island, hiking on their family's new ranch. He was, as I mentioned, he was barely a teenager at the time. The chapel as it stood in 1937. This is 2 months after they bought the island. You can see the grapes on the hill. Originally, the chapel stood open among the vineyards. The Cares had raised grapes and had produced wine. That operation was shut down during Prohibition, although grapes did continue to be sold for a time. The Stantons eventually did remove most of the grapes. I love this. Carey Stanton's in junior high school, and he has to write a paper. So he writes a paper about the Santa Barbara Islands, and in his paper, he mentions his father. When Edwin Stanton bought the Santa Cruz Island Company and all of its possessions. Carey did ride as a boy growing up on an island, but he was attending school on the mainland, and so he was only on the island for vacations and weekends. Here you see him on the pier. It's hard to believe he looks so young here that 2 years later he would go to Stanford. Here he is with his mother. This wagon was left by the Care family, as were most of the wagons, and unfortunately a lot of the equipment was burned in a fire, which we'll see in a moment. Here's Carey Stanton with some of his friends. If you look closely, you'll see a board covered with abalones. They'd gone to the beach to go abalone hunting to have a nice feast. You cannot see abalones on the rocks the way they used to be. So in 1940, Carey Stanton went off to Stanford University as an undergraduate. He was there from 1940 until 1944, and he was a member of a fraternity called the Deeks. And he befriended and became best friends with Richard Diebenkorn, who was to become a very well-known, very famous California artist. Carey, being a young man of means, began patronizing Dick's work, and in 1943 he bought Palo Alto Circle. Today this is probably one of the more famous of Richard Diebenkorn's paintings. It's in the holdings of the collection of the Santa Cruz Island Foundation, but it is the extremely early oil by Richard Diebenkorn during the time they were both in Stanford. In the meantime, Carey's older brother, who also went to Berkeley, had enrolled in the Army and was shipped out to France. You see Eddie on the left. He leaves for World War II and is killed in Normandy. This leaves Carey Stanton, the only surviving son, to his parents. And it was a tragedy within the family, in particular because Eddie was being groomed as my son the rancher, the one to whom the island presumably would go. He would take over the ranching operations. And Carey Stanton went to medical school. He was my son the doctor. As it turned out, Eddie was killed and unable to fulfill what his parents had in mind for his future. So throughout the 40s, the Stantons raised cattle on the islands. Here you see Mr. and Mrs. Stanton. I love Ed Stanton's saddle. He didn't ride in a normal Western saddle. This is an Australian saddle, very rare for the 1940s. It has big elephant ears on it right here, you can see. And that saddle today is on the island in a small exhibit of the historic island saddles. Somehow Ed Stanton knew the actor Eddie Albert, whom you can see here. This is in the late 40s. Carey continued on at Stanford, past undergraduate school. He went right into medical school, and Cy Kinsell, a classmate of his with whom I'm still in touch today, said that in those days during World War II, doctors were encouraged to advance their studies, and they went 4 quarters for 3 years, and as a result of this advanced study, Carey Stanton graduated as a medical doctor in 3 rather than 4 years. It was during his days at Stanford that he began dating Marion Whitbeck, seen here. She remained his paramour for almost half a century, certainly more than 40 years. They never married. In the meantime, when Eddie had gone off to World War II, right before he departed, he had married. His wife was pregnant. Eddie was killed. A son was born, the namesake son, Edwin Loxley Stanton III. So as little Eddie was growing up, he spent vacation time, with his grandparents on Santa Cruz Island. At the time the Stantons purchased the island in 1937, this is a photo in 1938, there was a very, very large, considered California bungalow. It had about 18 rooms, bedrooms. It was a U-shape around a corridor. This was the home that the Carey family had built in the teens. It was built of wood by an architect named Carlton Winslow. Well, on June 12th, 1950, it's thought that a faulty electrical wire on a refrigerator of the porch of this house is what started the fire that burned not only that house, but the fire spread to the adjacent wineries, gutted the wineries, and most of the historic buggies and farm implements were destroyed in that fire. Here you can see the upper winery. The roof was off. At that point, the wineries had shake roofs. The upper and lower wineries were gutted by the fire. So Ed Stanton hired an architect, a very well-known at that time Los Angeles architect named Roy Kelly. And Roy Kelly designed the new house to be built where the old ranch house had burned, and this was called the Phoenix House. Out of the ashes rises the phoenix. So Ed Stanton oversaw the construction of the Phoenix House. They began construction in December of 1950. The house was finished in 1951. This 2-story adobe, which is called the Justinian House, was part of the original ranch house that had existed, that the Stantons bought when it had been a ranch house when the Careys were there. It's an adobe that is actually the oldest known building on the island. It dates back to at least 1854. The first story of it does, at any rate. So the Phoenix house was added on, attached to the Justinian house, and this was to become the main ranch for Mr. and Mrs. Stanton. Their bedrooms are in this house, as is a formal living room and 2 bathrooms and a large fireplace. At the same time, the Stantons decided to add on to the office some guest rooms. So 2 bedrooms were added on at the same time to provide space for visiting guests, since they had lost all of the many bedrooms in the bungalow that had burned. I put this in particularly for you, Anne. This is the view from the new Phoenix house, with the yard being planted. Oops, and Ed Stanton, who was a hands-on man, unlike his physician's son. Ed Stanton loved to work with his hand, work with tools. Here he's welding some care-built fencing around the main ranch. Another house that the Stantons built, it's the only satellite ranch built under the direction of the Stantons, is called Rancho del Norte. Today this house, this ranch, is owned by the National Park Service. And this was built as an out ranch so that cowboys working cattle on the far east of the island would have a camp and a place to stay. At this point, this is Dr. Carey Stanton. He's graduated from Stanford University School of Medicine in pathology. He didn't go into any of the pursuits of medicine where you had to deal with the living. He preferred to deal with the dead. Marion continues to visit the island. Here they are with Carey's dog, Queenie. She's a beautiful, beautiful woman, and as I mentioned, they stayed friends for his lifetime. Little Eddie continues to come to the island with his grandparents. Many of you are familiar with the swimming hole La Cascada. This was developed by Ed Stanton. He had some cementation put in front of the bowl at the creek in this canyon to provide a nice swimming hole. At the main ranch in 1956, here they are. I don't know why they have a milk cow outside their little yard area, but Evelyn Stanton to the right. Ed Stanton is getting older here. The following year, in 1957, he asked his son if he would consider moving to the island. Ed's health had begun to fail, and he felt that it was time for Carey to consider coming to the island. From 1947, when Carey had graduated medical school, for the next 10 years, until 1957, he practiced medicine and lived primarily on the East Coast. He had done his internship at New York City Hospital. He had become involved with the Wadsworth Atheneum in Connecticut. He was very involved with learning about antique American furniture, and he developed a passion for early American furniture, and he began collecting it when he was back east during this 10-year period. So in 1957, Carey Stanton was only 34 years old. He gave up the practice of medicine, and he moved to Santa Cruz Island to help his father. Here he is again with Marion at the ranch. Carey always had dogs with him. You'll notice through the slides there are sequences of dogs, never a particular breed. Towards the end of his life, he preferred Rottweilers, but very seldom was he without a dog at his side. I love this photograph. This shows the main ranch in the 1950s, and you'll notice 2 tremendous redwood silos. These silos were left from the Carey era when the Carey family, they grew a lot of grain, and the silos were indeed needed. With the Stantons didn't have the agricultural pursuits that had been practiced under the Careys, so unfortunately the silos had become unstable, and the decision was made to pull them down. Today you can still find the foundations of them, however, out in the western yard of the ranch. In 1958, Carey reinitiated the tradition of celebrating Mass in the chapel on Santa Cruz Island. Carey had built the chapel. It was finished in 1891. That's when the first Mass was celebrated. But Mass was celebrated on an irregular basis. In 1958, Carey, very much a historian by avocation, began the tradition of inviting priests to celebrate Mass. And here you see Carey outside the chapel. I love this. Carey's parents, in 1958, for Ed Stanton's 65th birthday, they're in the Phoenix house, obviously a very happy couple. One of the very first large pieces Carey Stanton purchased is this chest on chest. It's cherry wood. It was made in Connecticut in 1765 by a man named Chapin. It turns out that among American furniture, it is one of the best preserved chest on chests by this maker extant. It was on the cover of an antiques magazine. Carey saw it, called the antiques dealer, paid $5,000 for it, and had it crated and shipped to Santa Cruz Island. Today, this piece is worth close to $1 million. We keep our hats and T-shirts in it at the office. Continuing with his tradition of collecting fine furniture and paintings, he purchased this painting by a German artist named Hahn. It's called Mexican Cattle Drivers, as a 45th wedding anniversary for his parents. It immediately was hung above in the Phoenix house, where it still hangs today. The fascinating thing to me is when you read anything about William Hahn and his paintings, it's not uncommon to find references to the missing Hahn painting. Well, Carey purchased this painting at Kennedy Galleries in New York, immediately had it crated and sent to Santa Cruz Island, where it's hung for over half a century. It's only missing because it's on an island west of the West Coast and no one knew where it went. In front of the Justinian house at the main ranch were two large truck gardens, vegetable gardens. The ranch raised some of its own produce. And here you see Ed Stanton, 2 years before the end of his life, on his beloved ranch. Ed Stanton died in 1963, leaving Carey to run the ranch. Evelyn, Ed Stanton's wife, lived another 10 years beyond her husband's life. So from this point on, Carey Stanton was left to make most of the major decisions about the island's operations. He did consult with his mother, who inherited 2/3 of the island. And remember, there's that nephew. Carey started filling the ranch buildings, the houses, with his collections of fine American furniture and American silver. He continued throughout his lifetime to collect paintings by Richard Diebenkorn. Today the foundation has 48 of them. You'll see the Diebenkorn paintings throughout the house. And I love this. This is the upstairs of the Justinian house. That's just a screen door with a glass partial door. Dick Diebenkorn sat in a chair and looked out that window and painted a painting. See this painting here? Well, Dick was out on the island for a couple weeks painting, and he sat in the chair and he thought, my, that's a fine view. So he painted the view with the screen door closed. You see the screen door? And that was the roof of the adjacent Phoenix house, the red roof, and the upper winery, and the lower winery, and the eucalyptus grove beyond. This is the iron rail. If you look closely, those are 2 purple dog beds for the 2 Rottweilers. The maid had picked up the dog beds and was airing them out outside the door. So Dick then used that watercolor as a study for his oil painting. People who see this oil painting, it's a very well-known painting, think, my, it's an interesting abstract. Well, it becomes more interesting when you realize, whoops, let me back up. When you realize that's the frame of the screen door, that's a dog bed, that's a dog bed, that's the roof of the Phoenix house. He simply didn't like the wineries or the eucalyptus trees, and he made sky and water. In 1964, Dick Diebenkorn also designed, at Carey's request, a flag for Santa Cruz Island. And the flag he designed represents the island in several ways. The blue, of course, is for the sky and the water that surrounds the island. Since it is named the Island of the Holy Cross, there is a white cross on a hill that's floating. That's the island. And the green represents the pastures. I had a note card made one year. Dick was still alive, Carey had died. And I recreated the flag on the note card, and I was so proud. I had gotten the colors perfect. They were exact match colors. And I sent Dick the card. Not long after he got it, he called, and I said, "So, how did I do?" He said, "You've slaughtered the golden mean." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "The golden mean. Sure, the colors are fine, but your proportions are all wrong. I'd like you to destroy all those cards." I didn't know what the golden mean was, but I sure looked it up, and I sure know what it is now. It's a mathematical progression, and it has to do with where this point falls along this line. Well, the cardstock I used, this point fell over in here somewhere, so I slaughtered the golden mean. I stand guilty. So one of the first things Carey did to generate income from the island, in addition to raising cattle, was to lease a small portion of land at the end of the Central Valley, called Valley Anchorage, to a defense company, General Motors. So a lease was signed in 1965. In 1983, a company called Maripro took over the lease. Maripro was subsequently bought by SAIC. This generated a significant income for Santa Cruz Island and helped Carey operate the island and maintain the buildings in the beautiful condition in which he did. In addition to the lease at Maripro, in 1965, he initiated a hunting operation with his friend Bob Lagomarsino's brother, Rick Lagomarsino. And so for 20 years, from 1965 until 1985, the hunting operation was conducted on Santa Cruz Island, which was a win-win situation. Hunters liked to pay good money for the opportunity of shooting a feral sheep or a feral pig. It kept the animal numbers down, and everyone was happy about it. And for those of you who know Jarrett Owens, there's a very young Jarrett in this photograph. Jarrett went on later to run the hunting operations on the east end of the island for Francis Greene. So by 1966, the chapel stood out in the field. The grapevines had been removed. The swimming pool had been put in to the east of the Phoenix house that the Stantons had built. And there were 2 blackwood acacia trees, which eventually Carey had taken down. He was afraid they might fall on the chapel. But you'll notice there's no cemetery yet. We're up to the 1960s, 1968. Island Packers starts business. Thank you, Cheryl, for this photograph. And I might add that I'm very proud tonight to be sitting in an auditorium that's named for my father-in-law, Bill Connolly, who is right here, and the founder of Island Packers. Cheryl is standing in the back of the room, as is my husband, Kirk. That's brother Mark, Lil, Brad, and Margaret Beauregard. Maggie. Mass continued to be celebrated on the island in the chapel, and Carey Stanton always liked to stay in touch with the remaining Care family members. In this case, you'll see Justy Care right here. He is the grandson of Justinian Care, who was the main developer of the island. And Marcia, his wife, is back here. And this is our priest, Monsignor Weber. Monsignor Weber began celebrating Mass in the chapel in 1968 and has celebrated Mass every consecutive May 3rd for 40 years, with 2 rain-out dates in 40 years. From a very early age, Carey Stanton, this is in 1938, loved cemeteries. There had originally been 2 ranch workers that were killed on the island. They had been buried on a flat at Prisoners Harbor, Angelo Forno and Tomas Sansoni. Here, Carey's repairing the little fence around the cemetery. In 1972, Carey decided to design a cemetery around the chapel. So he used recycled, Care-built iron to create a fence around the chapel, and then he designed who would go inside the chapel cemetery and where they would go. So he actually orchestrated the cemetery, in which he then moved his parents, his maternal grandparents, his maternal uncle, Tomas and Angelo, who had been down at Prisoners Harbor, are now in this cemetery. One of them had been killed by a cart in the ranch yard. He was feeding some hogs, and a cart trampled him. And Angelo Forno was killed when he fell off of his horse. Someone had shut a gate. He was galloping. He was drunk. He didn't know the gate had been shut. The horse went to jump the fence. He fell off and broke his neck. It's interesting because when I was out there when Carey had the bodies dug up, and Angelo Forno, the back of his head, had a hole in it about the size of a 50-cent piece. And Carey thought, my, that looks like a bullet hole. So some of you in the audience might remember the very famous Los Angeles coroner, Noguchi. Well, the head got packed up and sent to Noguchi for his opinion. And it came back that, in fact, it was consistent with a fracture from a fall from a horse, and it was not, in fact, a bullet. One of Carey's fondest, greatest achievements was the establishment of an agreement with the University of California whereby Santa Cruz Island would become a part of the university's California Reserve System. The agreement was formalized in 1973, although Carey had invited the university to have classes and summer field groups come out as early as 1964. The year that the field station became operational, let me back up. In 1973 is the year, as Ann mentioned, that I started working on the island. It was shortly before the dedication that I started my tenure on Santa Cruz Island. So by now we're up to May of 1973. Evelyn Stanton, Carey's mother, dies in November of that year. That year, Carey sold his parents' very large house in Hancock Park in Los Angeles and bought this Victorian historic home in Sierra Madre known as the Pegler House. He then spent a number of years taking the house back to its original condition. He even had the swimming pool not filled in, but the cement removed. Carey was a stickler for detail, wanted to do things right, and when he set his mind to doing something, he only wanted it done correctly. He moved into the main ranch, the two-story house. He had put all of his possessions that were island-related. His American furniture went to the island. His parents' and grandparents' Victorian furniture stayed in the Victorian home in Sierra Madre. And throughout the ranch, you'll find his, let me back up, the furniture and paintings and art, which he loved so dearly. He had begun collecting, when they became available, California art as it pertained to the Channel Islands. There are precious few paintings done of the Channel Islands, particularly Santa Cruz Island, and those that have been done he was able to acquire during his lifetime. The sitting room of the upstairs of the Justinian house, again, has the Diebenkorn paintings in it and a beautiful leather Queen Anne chair. Carey was a voracious reader, and his library has upwards of 5,000 volumes in it. There's a photograph of Marion here, and when they were in college. One of the treasures in this room is this plate, which is one of the original surviving plates of Justinian Care and his family from their dining room. The dining room, as Carey had it decorated, he had a beautiful cherry wood table. Fortuny fabrics, for those of you who know your fabrics, this is the last of the Fortuny House of Italy. The swags here are Fortuny fabrics. And the nerve center of the office of the ranch remained the office, much as it had been in the Care time. The Care ranch records are still up here, and Carey's desk was here. In 1961, Ed Stanton hired a man named Henry Duffield, who had been paralyzed from polio, to become the ranch manager. Whoops, let me back up. Henry's desk was here. So Henry lived on Santa Cruz Island managing the cattle operations from 1961 until he committed suicide on the island in 1986. The entire time he lived on the island, he came paralyzed from the waist down, but he had a stroke, and the stroke took out the upper quarter of his body, which only left the upper quarter with his right hand, and it was his way as a rancher to end his life. Here comes Eddie, the nephew. His grandmother has died. Uncle Carey has all of the advantages of living on an island. Eddie owns 1/3 undivided interest in Santa Cruz Island and gets no monetary rewards and spends very little time on the island. He didn't think this was fair, so he sued his Uncle Carey. Carey was beside himself. He had to figure out something to do with Santa Cruz Island. He used to say that it really was a very terrible burden on him. One wouldn't think that owning an island could be a burden, but he used to say it is a terrible burden. He had strong convictions. He knew that he never wanted, at this point, the island to go into government hands, be it federal or state. He didn't want the island to turn into another Yosemite. He didn't want pavement. He didn't want tens of thousands of people carrying seeds in their socks and introducing animals to the island that didn't belong there. So he thought long and hard about what was going to happen to Santa Cruz Island. It was as a result of the lawsuit of his nephew that he really had to come to a conclusion about what would happen to Santa Cruz Island beyond his lifetime. In 1975, I got a call from a man named Jake Kittle, who was on the board of an organization, a little-known organization in California called the Nature Conservancy. Jake called me and he said, "Marla, we have a plan, the California Board of the Conservancy. We'd like to try and acquire Santa Cruz Island from Carey Stanton, but we somehow need to meet him. Can you help us?" And I said, "Well, I can try." He said, "We'll put together a talk at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Do you think you can get Carey to go?" And I said, "Well, I'll see if he's available." So I phoned Carey and I told him this, and he said, "Well, I'll listen to what they have to say." So he flew off the island and we went to a meeting at the Museum of Natural History. And a lovely man named Ken Wiley gave a talk, a presentation about the Nature Conservancy, and Carey was interested. Al Vail also went to the talk. He wasn't particularly interested. Al Vail at the time was running Santa Rosa Island next door. So that's what began a wonderful relationship with Carey Stanton and his decision to leave the island to the Nature Conservancy. He called up his friend Bob Anderson from ARCO. They kicked in $1 million. Just under $3 million was raised. The Nature Conservancy had a campaign. For $72, you could save an acre of Santa Cruz Island, and thousands of people sent in checks for $72. Dozens of women sent marriage proposals from all over the country. A lot of them from the South. I couldn't figure out why women from the South, but a lot of women from the South. I still have them. So at any rate, Bob Anderson kicked in $1 million, and the deal was signed in 1978. Carey was so pleased and so relieved. His nephew was paid off $900,000. Little Eddie went away. Carey received $900,000. His mother's estate taxes of about $500,000 were paid. A small endowment was formed, and the lawyers were paid. It was a win-win situation. Everyone was happy. Carey actually at the time said to his attorney, Dick Bergen, "I don't want any money. I just want to do the right thing." And Dick Bergen said, "You pay me for my advice, you'll at least match the amount that Eddie is getting paid, or I won't be your lawyer." Carey said, "All right, if you insist." So that's how Carey's check matched that of his nephew. It wasn't twice, because Carey owned 2/3, the nephew owned 1/3. It was just an even match. He was so excited, he bought himself this painting called Captain McGuire Catching Seals. This is Painted Cave on Santa Cruz Island. Today this painting is in the Phoenix House at the main ranch. It was purchased in 1978, as I said, as Carey's reward to himself for finally signing the deal with the Nature Conservancy. Park Service was very unhappy. The Park Service had hoped that Carey Stanton would consider them as the venue to which Carey would leave the island. The Park Service had had a superintendent that had one day walked into Carey's office, sat down in his chair, put his feet up on the desk and said, "Yep, someday this is going to be ours." And Carey thought to himself, "No, it isn't." So it's my opinion that it was the actions of a particular superintendent that really rubbed Carey the wrong way, that set the tone for Carey's not even considering Channel Islands National Park, which didn't exist at that time, as a venue for the island. In 1980, Channel Islands National Park, the legislation was signed by Carey's very good friend, Congressman Bob Lagomarsino. Remember, his brother is operating the Hunt Club on the island. Well, Santa Cruz Island, the Stanton portion, would not go to the national park, but Al Vail's Island, Santa Rosa, was destined to go to Channel Islands National Park, as was the east end of Santa Cruz Island. So this is one of those rare days when Bill Ehorn, wonderful superintendent of this park, he was here for a very long time, came out to the island. There's Al Vail and other park officials, and they just came out to lunch to talk about all of the things that were happening with the future of the Channel Islands. 1981, Mass has continued to be celebrated annually by Monsignor Weber. I like this photograph. If you notice the coins on the chapel, every other one is a cross carved in bas relief from volcaniclastic stone quarried on Santa Cruz Island. The brick were made on the island as well by Italian brickmakers in the 19th century. Carey was a very inquisitive man, very well-educated man, obviously. He was a man of letters. He loved learning. Campbell Grant called one day and said, "You know, I've heard there's some pictographs and petroglyphs in a cave out there." Carey said, "Yes, Olson's Cave. I'd be glad to show you." So he invited Campbell Grant out, and they went to Olson's Cave along the north side of the island and discussed the various pictographs. One day I was driving around with Carey in the Jeep, and he said, "Stop! Stop the Jeep." He said, "Come on, I want to show you something." We were in an area called Alameda de los Coches on the south side of the island. We were going through bushes. Carey was forging ahead of me. We turned the corner, and here was the mouth of this cave. He said, "I found this cave when I was 14 years old, and it's got rock art in it." At this point, he was in his 60s. So that's the cave that Carey showed me the day that he said, "Stop the Jeep." Another day, 1982, he got a call from the sheriff's department. "We hear you've got a pot plantation out on your island." Carey said, "What? Where? How do you know?" And they said, "It's on the south side of the island near an anchorage called Albert's. We need to go out and see it." Carey said, "Pick me up at Coches Prietos. I'm coming with you." So the sheriff's department came out. We went down to Coches Prietos and went over to Albert's and crawled through the bushes, went way up the canyon, and sure enough, someone had a very sophisticated system of hoses and drip lines and water delivery system. So one of the sheriffs that was with us that day, he took a stick, he hammered it in the ground, and he took out his business card, and he wrote on it, "Call me." And he left it. Obviously, no one ever called him. But as a medical doctor, even though Carey was not practicing active medicine, he always kept his license current. Through the years, he continued to attend seminars so that he would maintain his status as an active practicing physician. But he was the veterinarian for his animals, and he did practice medicine on his cows. He did the vaccinating, castrating, and branding, along with help from the vaqueros. This is after an ear-cutting session up at the Norte. He's all covered with the blood splatters, and the branding irons are in the hot furnace here. This is down at Prisoner's Harbor. He's administering medicine to one of the bulls who had an infected eye. Santa Cruz Island was a cow-calf operation, which means they had bulls, they had cows, and they raised calves, as opposed to Santa Rosa Island next door. The Vail and Vickers, they were a stocker or a feeder operation. They brought out young calves, fattened them for a long year, a year and a half, and then took them to market. And it was not uncommon for Vail and Vickers to come and buy all the calves from Santa Cruz Island, pick them up on the Vaquero, their cattle boat, and take them to Santa Rosa Island. The two as neighbors, their grandparents had been friends, the Stantons and the Vails. Their parents had been friends, and Carey Stanton and Al Vail were very good friends, and they maintained their friendship and working relationship for their lifetimes. I love this. Ed Stanton having a maid give him a haircut, and to the right, here's his son, Carey Stanton, with Lyndall, who gave Carey his haircuts for more than 25 years. So those of you who know Lyndall never got paid a nickel, but for more than 2 decades, he gave Carey his haircuts as well. Some of you wonder how Carey Stanton knows Joe Walsh, who is a guitar player with the Eagles. Many of you know of this relationship. They became friends. I introduced them in 1978. Joe was married on Santa Cruz Island, and his daughter, my goddaughter, was christened in the chapel in 1983. They maintained a very close friendship until Carey's death. Today, Joe serves on the board of the Santa Cruz Island Foundation. 1984, another Mass in the chapel with Marcia Kerr on the left and Barbara Merritt on the right, and he's holding a piece of the True Cross, which was given to the chapel. It came through Rome with documentation that the sliver of wood that's in the reliquary here is from the cross carried by Jesus. Carey had a thing for crosses. He owned the island of the Holy Cross. So in 1984, when the cathedral was being torn down in Los Angeles, there were a number of iron crosses and this very large redwood cross. Carey went by and said, "Say, what are you going to do with that?" They said they were going to cut it up. And he said, "May I make some special arrangements?" And so here, with the help of Nature Conservancy, here's Peter Schuyler. The cross was set on the hill behind the ranch so that today, as you drive up the lane, you see the large redwood cross for the island of the Holy Cross. And although Carey Stanton was not a Catholic, Monsignor Weber used to tease him that, in fact, he was more Catholic than most he knew. Carey always insisted that the Mass be celebrated in Latin. As a traditionalist, there were to be no Masses in English, always in the traditional Latin. Carey had a number of friends, one of whom is in this audience right here. Whoops, back up. Buzz Bonsall was a friend of Carey for many, many years. He, in fact, was married on the island in 1985, and here they are enjoying cocktail hour by the statue of Pan outside the Phoenix House. And the year Buzz was married, he and his wife very kindly gave Carey as a wedding present a fabulous painting by Ludmilla Welch done on Santa Cruz Island in 1917. Turns out that Ludmilla Welch did at least 7 such paintings of coves along the north side of the island. Her husband Thaddeus Welch is a very well-known California painter. She went along as the wife. Well, the wife did the fabulous paintings of Santa Cruz Island, 6 of which are owned, were acquired by Carey Stanton, and one of which was sold at auction that we don't own. As I mentioned, Carey loved his dogs, his Rottweilers, Fido and Barca here. Carey was a man of habit, and to go to the island or to fly off of the island, he dressed. He had his to-town outfit and his coming back to the island outfit. And every day, 24 hours a day, was regimented. When phone calls were made, when they were accepted, meals, 5 meals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said it was simply too hard to train a maid to cook more than 5 meals. It made grocery shopping easy. He had the same grocery list. Groceries were delivered on a boat every 2 weeks, and Cornish game hen and ham And Salisbury steak, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The only day that it changed was when he had gone overseas or taken a large trip, and the night he came home, it was always beef tongue. I had started working on Santa Cruz Island in 1973 for the university. I became Carey Stanton's personal assistant through the years, and one of my greatest joys during this time was to spend time with Carey, writing down, taking notes, and tape recording his knowledge of the history of Santa Cruz Island. He had a library between his ears that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And so I very fortunately was in a position, right place at the right time, to capture a lot of this information that otherwise would be lost with his death. In this particular instance, we're on a boat going circumnavigating the island, and we went to Gull Island, and he showed me where a fisherman's shack had been atop Gull Island. Here we are at Carey's favorite picnicking beach, Cochas Prietos, on the south side of the island, with the ranch manager Henry Duffield and Joe Walsh and myself. This little picnic table was one of Carey's treasures. It was so corny. It was metal, and it was a suitcase. And you unlatch the suitcase, fold it out, and there were 2 benches, and somebody had to sit on each side, otherwise it would flip over. So we had to sit down very carefully, and he had this tube that was one of the early Coleman cooler tubes that took a 6-pack of beer or soft drinks, and it had a spring in the bottom. You shoved the drinks down, and then you screwed the top on. When you unscrewed the top, the drinks went boing and came out of this long tube. So those were part of the regular things that were carried to these picnics. Carey turned 64 on February 20th, 1987. It was the last birthday he was to live to see, and the Park Service did a wonderful thing, thanks to Bill Ehorn. For Carey's birthday, Bill Ehorn said, "Golly, have you and your neighbors ever visited each other, the Guarinis and the Stantons?" And Carey said no, and Bill said, "I'm going to make that possible." So he chartered a helicopter, and the helicopter picked all of us up, and we first flew to the east end of the island, and Carey Stanton, Bill Ehorn, John Greeny, and Pierre Greeny, and we visited at the east end of the island, and Carey was able to walk through the buildings and to see the buildings at Scorpion that had been built by the Carey family that were not a part of the assets acquired by the Santa Cruz Island Company. In turn, we took the helicopter over to the main ranch, and Pierre Greeny had not seen his grandfather's ranch for a very, very, very long time, decades and decades and decades. And so it was a wonderful day where 2 neighbors got to helicopter back and forth to visit one another. Carey lived to celebrate his family's 50th anniversary of owning Santa Cruz Island on April 10th. A special mass was held, and he invited his lawyer, Dick Bergen, who was the one who had done the paperwork with the Nature Conservancy for the island's acquisitions. Lyndall was there, who since 1968 has worked at the university's Santa Cruz Island Reserve and continues to live on the island. David Watts, the attorney who took over for Dick Bergen when Dick retired, is here. Al Vail, Richard Diebenkorn, Phyllis Diebenkorn, there's Marion in the back, Polly Gooden from Los Angeles, Lotzie Bush Flanagan from the Anheuser-Busch family. Lunch was at the pool. There's Dick Diebenkorn, his wife Phyllis. Marion was there, of course. Carey said to me, "Marla, take my picture standing on my grave." And I said, "You're weird." He said, "No, I want you to take my picture because someday you're going to put me in this hole." And I said, "All right." So I did take his picture. He's standing on his own grave. Remember, he orchestrated who went where. And I did put his ashes in his grave after his death, December 8th, 1987. He died at Santa Cruz Island in the second floor of the Justinian House. He died what is called an electric death. His heart stopped. His father before him had died of a heart attack as well. He was only 64 years old. So at that point, Santa Cruz Island went to the Nature Conservancy. A funeral was held for Carey on the island. There's Tehona, his little dachshund, ended up going to, this is a great story, She was flown to Santa Rosa Island. She only knew island life. She didn't know mainland life, but she knew islands, and Al Vail said, bring her over to our island. So we had a plane come especially for Tehona, and she went to Santa Rosa Island where she lived out her life. Interesting. Remember the nephew that sued Carey, and Eddie had been killed in World War II? When Carey formed the cemetery, he called his nephew and said, may I put my brother's ashes in the cemetery? And Eddie said, no. Carey said, golly, all right, I'm sorry. Nothing Carey could do. When Carey died, David Watts, Carey's attorney, got a phone call. It was Eddie. He said, I don't really care where my dad's buried. You can put him next to his brother. So I went down to Inglewood Park Cemetery, picked up Carey's brother's ashes, and during the dedication to the Nature Conservancy, Kirk and I interred Carey's brother's ashes next to Carey's, and could have knocked my socks off. Kirk dug the hole. We got down deep. There was a cenotaph, which is a marker for someone where the remains aren't. Kirk said, there's something in here. Well, lo and behold, Carey had never told me this, lo and behold, in the bottom of the hole were the medals, spurs, diploma, a lot of things that were his brother's possessions. So we were able to put them back in the hole along with Eddie's cremains. It was a wonderful day, May 3rd, 1988, to pick for the Nature Conservancy to take over the helm of Santa Cruz Island. It was Mass, and a wonderful celebration was held. This particular broadside was printed on a hand press on Santa Cruz Island for this occasion. It's a very rare keepsake. Mildred Mathias, a very famous botanist from UCLA, gave the dedication. She had been very instrumental in guiding Carey's hand with the agreement that he signed with the Nature Conservancy. They had been friends for many decades. And about 100 people attended the dedication. Some of you know the Brown brothers, Tony and Johnny. They're still very involved in the Santa Cruz Island Foundation and with operations that we have on Santa Cruz Island. Lyndall was at the dedication with Bob Hansen. A plaque was dedicated to the Nature Conservancy and the Stanton family. And since the Nature Conservancy takes care of natural, biological items, Carey Stanton's number one love, passion, and avocation was history, the cultural history of Santa Cruz Island and the other Channel Islands. In 1985, he had formed the Santa Cruz Island Foundation as his own private nonprofit to deal with the cultural histories of the California Channel Islands. And since his death, the antiques, furniture, silver, his personal possessions were left to the Santa Cruz Island Foundation, while the land and the buildings went to the Nature Conservancy. And we have a working agreement with the Conservancy whereby they continue to borrow and to use Carey's beloved items on Santa Cruz Island as they were left in situ at the time of Carey's death. Since Carey's death, the Foundation published quite a number of books dealing with the histories of the 8 California Channel Islands, and we will continue to do so into the future. And I would like to end by thanking Anne for inviting me to come and speak to this venue this evening. Thank you very much.